So when it comes to what-if ideas, I'm sure this one has been on everyone's mind since episode 2 of House of the Dragon. With the death of his queen and newborn son, the bloodline of the dragon is seemingly spread thin. King Viserys names his daughter heir out of guilt and grief, but with so few Targaryens left in the world, just having one heir isn't enough. So the king is counseled to remarry and produce more children. People die all the time in Westeros, and with the king being sick, his brother estranged, and daughter unwed with no heirs of her own yet, the king has to make up for these shortcomings, lest he risk the dragon dynasty going extinct. So the king decides to remarry in order to extend the family line. He's given two choices, or shall I say one, since Coryls was the only one to make an official offer to the king. Laena was his only daughter, and at 12 years old, he suggested that she be betrothed to King Viserys. Realistically, the marriage was a good idea. The Velaryons were the richest house in the realm, with a large naval force, but with the addition of Rhaenys to the bloodline, they now had access to dragons, a power which up until now, only the Targaryens could lay claim to. Marrying Laena would have united the two houses, made sure the dragons were all on one side for the most part, and possibly prevented any future resistance and conflict from the Velaryons, since they'd be bound in blood. But when the time came to make his choice, the king chose Lady Alicent Hightower instead of Lady Laena Velaryon. This choice, made with heart instead of head, had some dastardly ramifications. Coryls the Sea Snake resigned as master of ships, Rhaenyra had a falling out with her best friend and father that lasted for years, Viserys fathered the Green Bloodline, which some would argue actually started the dreaded Dance of the Dragons. But would things have changed if he made a different choice? If he chose Laena to be his queen? Would the realm be united or divided in a disastrous dance all the same? Let's see what would happen if Viserys chose Laena. We'll set the stage at the end of episode 2, where Viserys comes to make his decision. For the past 6 months, Viserys has been visited by Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his loyal hand, Otto Hightower. Ever since the death of his wife, Alicent had been a comforting presence to the king, a friend he hadn't known he would need in such dark times. During those months, and the time remarriage had been on his mind, he'd imagined what life would be like with Alicent as his queen. Things would be easy, comfortable. She would care for him like she had these past 6 months. And when the time came, he had no doubt she would be a great mother to any children that they might have. He'd known her since she was a girl, but now in his eyes, at the age of 15, she was a woman grown. Laena, on the other hand, was a different story. She was still a child in his eyes at the age of 12, only 3 years younger than the Lady Alicent. It was clear she didn't really want to be his queen, and was just being forced to play along, especially since she was being fed lines by her father Coryls to make herself seem more accepting and agreeable.
Your Grace, it would be a great honor to join our houses, as they were in old Valyria. I would give you many children of pure Valyrian blood, so that we might strengthen the royal line and the realm.
Is that what your father told you to say?
Neither of them seemed to be comfortable with the possibility of wedding one another, but duty was never meant to be a comfortable thing for anyone, not even a king. Viserys has a responsibility to the realm, to look after his people and prevent conflict when able. What conflict could arise if he were to spurn the Velaryons now? As I mentioned earlier, the Velaryons have a vast fleet, they're a rich family, and most importantly, they now have dragons. It may not be immediate, but who knows how they could retaliate against him in the future if he made an enemy of them now. The Velaryons had been long-standing friends of House Targaryen. They were kin even, though the relation may be considered distant. He gains nothing but potential problems by making them an enemy. Rhaenys was the oldest living child of Prince Aemon Targaryen, the old King Jaehaerys' first son. Maybe some thought she still had been robbed of the crown. Maybe if given the proper incentive, they could support the claims of her and her children to the Iron Throne. He also gains nothing by wedding Alicent. Alicent is a comfort zone for Viserys, the easy option for him to make, but taking her as a wife does nothing for him or his family. Besides that, what would Rhaenyra think? She may have consented to him marrying another woman, but Alicent is her best friend. Would she even accept her as a stepmother? There was a reason he kept his affections for Alicent a secret, because deep down he knew that people wouldn't approve. Does he really want to risk dividing the realm and his family over his own comfort and complacency? These are things that Viserys thinks about in this new timeline. He actually weighs his options about what he can gain and what he can lose when it comes to marriage. Wedding Alicent gets him nothing, really. Maybe a loving wife and a better connection to the Hightower family and faith, but other than that, nothing substantial. Wedding Laena gets him the Velaryon fleet, more dragon riders. It brings together his claim to the Iron Throne with that of Rhaenys. The potential of rebellion from another dragon riding family is much lower since they'd be bound in blood this time around. And assuming Laena is capable when she comes of age, which we know she will be, he'll have more heirs to secure the Targaryen dynasty. It's more reward than risk when it comes to wedding Laena Velaryon, and that's why Viserys puts his emotions aside this time, and makes the right decision. I will wed the Lady Laena Velaryon, Viserys says, much to Otto's chagrin. The two are betrothed, and the wedding will take place in about 2 years when Laena is 14. Otto does still try to make Viserys reconsider, albeit very slyly. He doesn't outright say, hey, choose my daughter instead, but he does bring up some valid concerns, though. The Lady Laena is very young. It will be years before she can provide you with more children. Will she be able to handle the stress of producing more heirs? This strikes a chord in Viserys because it makes him think about Aemma. He and Aemma were engaged fairly young. In the books, Aemma got married to Viserys at 11 years old, and she got pregnant multiple times fairly early on into their marriage. This is probably why she had such a difficult time delivering, because of the toll those failed pregnancies took on her at such a young age. So Viserys does become a bit concerned about Laena. He doesn't want a repeat of what happened with his first wife. So while Viserys is second-guessing his decision, Otto does continue to push Alicent towards the king. Even though he is betrothed, nothing is set in stone yet. They haven't had a ceremony. They haven't consummated anything. The king can still change his mind. But that would most likely be worse for Viserys than just turning down the Velaryons outright. Because if he breaks his betrothal, he'll be going back on his word, and that will be sure to make an enemy out of the Sea Snake down the line. And this is what Alicent tells him when he asks if he made the right choice. Even if she won't be his queen, Viserys still holds her in high regard as a friend. So he heeds her words because they are true. He has to think long term. Duty over comfort. So as we move forward, what are some things that change as a result of Viserys' new decision? Well, for starters, the most obvious change is that Viserys never marries Alicent, so Rhaenyra and Alicent never have their falling out like they do in the canon timeline. In addition, and perhaps most importantly, the Green Children, Aegon, Helaena, Aemon, and Daemon, as we know them, do not exist. This also means that because Viserys weds Laena, Laena also never gets in with Daemon, so Baela and Rhaena do not exist in this timeline either. Rhaenyra also probably doesn't have to marry Laenor Velaryon, because the whole reason she even had to was because Viserys rejected Laena and spurned the Velaryons. Since no rift was ever made in this timeline, there's also nothing to patch up. So how else can the story change from here? With the engagement of Viserys and Laena, Coryls never resigns from his position as Master of Ships, so he gets to stay on the Small Council. This means that Tywin Lannister never takes his place. Since he keeps his position and is now in higher standing with the king, it's more likely that Viserys will now take his warnings about the Stepstones more seriously. So in this timeline, instead of Coryls and Daemon going after the Stepstones, it's Coryls and Viserys, or at least Viserys' soldiers and ships. So with that being said, I'm sure you're wondering, well, what happens to Daemon? In this timeline, things went pretty much the same until Viserys made his new decision. Daemon still makes his heir for a day joke and gets disinherited. He takes Dragonstone and claims Mysaria will be his second wife and is with his imaginary child, all in a vain attempt to garner the recognition of his big brother. In canon, after this fails, Coryls goes to Daemon to get his support for the conflict in the Stepstones. Coryls feels as if he and Daemon are kindred spirits. They always come in second, and they have both been spurned by the king. They both want to distinguish themselves and make their mark on the world. So why wouldn't they work together? But in this timeline, Coryls doesn't need Daemon. He has the king on his side, and there's no reason to call him back for help. At this moment, the king has a strained relationship with his brother, and Coryls will want to risk his standing with the king by trying to bring Daemon back into the fold, especially since the king hasn't tied the knot with his daughter yet. So with that in mind, what happens to Daemon? In canon, Daemon tags along with Coryls because he wants to prove himself to his brother, to prove he's irreplaceable and doesn't need anyone for anything. They need him, not the other way around.
Daemon, I know we've had our differences, but let them pass with the years. There's a place for you in my court. That's something you should need.
I need nothing.
With Coryls and his brother now working together, Daemon doesn't have the chance to distinguish himself and earn his place back at court on his own like he did in canon. He isn't going to stay on Dragonstone because there's no point. Mysaria has already left him, and because Viserys didn't come in person when he pulled his little prank, he knows that holding Dragonstone isn't enough to garner his brother's attention. There's no gain in staying here. So in this timeline, I'm actually going to say that Daemon goes back to the Vale, more specifically to Runestone, where his estranged wife, Lady Rhea Royce, is. Technically, despite their contempt for one another, Daemon still is her husband and technically the Lord of Runestone. And before you ask, no, he's not going back there to kill her like he did in canon. When Daemon arrives, it's not a warm welcome. Lady Rhea has some colorful things to say about him, and he has some things to say about her. They have a bit of a back and forth, with Rhea wondering why he even came back, even breaking up the comment he made about the sheep being prettier than the women in the Vale.
In the Vale, men are said to fuck sheep instead of women. I can assure you, the sheep are prettier.
Or have you at last come to consummate our marriage? The Vale sheep might be willing, even if I'm not. Our sheep are prettier, after all.
Daemon counters by saying they are still married and he is technically the Lord of Runestone, so he has every right to be there. It's clear that these two cannot stand each other, but for the time being, we'll say Rhea relents and the two manage to coexist on Runestone, albeit on somewhat shaky terms. Meanwhile, we'll fast forward about 3 years like we did in canon. Laena has now come of age and has married King Viserys. Because they had to wait a few years for Laena to mature, they started having kids later on than they did in canon. With Alicent, even though she didn't offer much politically, she was able to pretty much start having kids immediately because she was already of Westerosi legal age. But that's different now, and we'll say that what would have been Aegon's second birthday in canon is actually the first birthday of Laena and Viserys' children in this new timeline. Laena and Viserys have 2 children to start out with. Twins, which actually makes sense. In the real world, twins actually have a higher probability of producing more twins, and there are a lot of twins in House of the Dragon. You have Jason and Tylan, Eric and Arik, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, the twin daughter and son of Aegon II, Laenor and Laena, and even Laena's daughters with Daemon in the original timeline, Baela and Rhaena. In the books, they're actually called the Dragon Twins. But my point is that Laena having twins is actually very likely. So instead of having one child and another on the way like in canon, Viserys gets 2 new children to start out with, a boy and a girl, Aegon and Aela. Now, you may be wondering, Empyrean, why is the name different? Even though they weren't twins in canon, King Viserys had Aegon and Helaena, who were pretty close in age. Couldn't I just keep the same names of the Green Children? Well, there are a few reasons why I'm not doing that. Aside from me keeping things interesting, I want to make it clear that these are not the Green Children. These are quite literally new characters to the story. They have a different genetic makeup from the Green Children, with Laena as their mother. And because Laena is their mother, it's entirely plausible that the thought process behind naming the children between Laena and Viserys is different from the thought process he had with Alicent. Not to mention, when twins are born in this world, they usually have similar sounding names, and Helaena isn't very similar sounding to Aegon, but I digress. Like in canon, the king calls a hunt on his children's name day. Some differences here are that Coryls and Rhaenys are present during this time. With King Viserys' aid, we'll say they actually wrapped up the conflict in the Stepstones a bit earlier than in the original timeline. So this hunt counts as both a birthday celebration and a victory celebration. Rhaenyra is also present during this, and she spends a lot of time during this hunt with Alicent. Alicent is still her best friend in this timeline since she never married Viserys and had a falling out with Rhaenyra. This means Rhaenyra never distanced herself from her father as well because of his decision to wed Alicent. Everyone is a bit happier and closer to a degree in this timeline. During the hunt, Rhaenyra confides in Alicent about her own insecurities. Despite being named heir and more accepting of her new stepmother and siblings, she's still concerned about being replaced. Laena gave the king a son, and many still believe that a son comes before a daughter. Alicent is still supportive of Rhaenyra and says the king won't replace her. This is perfectly in line with her character because before the 10-year time skip, Alicent has made it abundantly clear multiple times that she supports Rhaenyra as the queen, but others don't share that same sentiment, like Jason Lannister or Otto Hightower. Despite failing to make Alicent the queen, he still firmly believes in the tradition and precedent set by Westeros that a son comes before a daughter. This argument isn't going to magically disappear just because the king has a new queen, especially with someone like Otto still around. This is perfectly in line with his character as well. He's not some power-hungry lunatic. He truly believes in the realm. He wants the realm to prosper, but when he sees an opportunity for his family to prosper as well, he takes that chance. I mean, the only time we ever really see him go against tradition and precedent is with Daemon. And that's because he doesn't think Daemon will be a good leader. And even then, supporting Rhaenyra was just a half measure in his eyes. Even though there's not much for him to gain in this timeline because Alicent isn't queen, that doesn't mean he's just going to sit on his hands and let Rhaenyra ascend peacefully. So during this hunt, I believe Otto is going to try and make something happen. Now, obviously, unlike in canon, his daughter is not the queen, as I've mentioned before. So we can't pull Laena aside and be like, hey, you have a son, he should be king and not his sister. Do what I say. He can't try to impose his will on her like he did with Alicent. But what he can do is try to convince her father, Lord Coryls Velaryon. Now, I'm sure this is probably one of the biggest questions people have when talking about this what if. Would Coryls push for his grandchild's claim to the Iron Throne? Coryls has let it be known that he doesn't really care about things like gender, calling Rhaenys' rejection at the Great Council of 101 small-minded. He doesn't even care about bastards inheriting the throne or his family name. But there is a reason behind all of that, and that is pride. People tend to forget just how ambitious Coryls Velaryon actually is. Despite the fact that he supports Rhaenyra and her sons, this is still the guy who wanted his 12-year-old daughter to marry the king, who was well into his 30s. Even when his own wife put the issue of her rejection behind her, he still tries to squeeze in wherever he can. If Rhaenys can get to the throne, then maybe his children can. Like Otto and many other lords in Westeros, when opportunity arises for his family, he takes it. The only real difference is that Coryls is kinda bold about his intentions. Even with the Strong Boys, though it's clear he does care for them, it's also very clear they're just pawns in the game. And that's not me trying to villainize Coryls. Everyone is a pawn in some way in A Song of Ice and Fire. The Strong Boys are just his key to immortality, his legacy.
My legacy will be determined in the coming months. You know what legacy means? It's what you pass down to your children and your children's children. It's what remains of you when you're gone.
Coryls wants to be remembered. He wants to leave something behind, so even when he dies, a piece of him will always live. Blood can thin, but legacy lasts forever. Which is why he doesn't really care that the Strong Boys aren't related to him. In the short term, sure, the fact that they aren't his blood may cause some problems, but in the long term, Coryls is kinda right.
History does not remember blood. It remembers names.
In 100 years, even if their lineage is disputed, without concrete proof and evidence, who's going to say the Strong Boys weren't actually related to him? They weren't there. They didn't know them personally. So all they can do is take the history books at their word. And because of that, when Jace and Luke rise to power, he'll always be attached to them. A great sailor and adventurer, the husband to the queen who never was, the father-in-law to the queen, the father to the king consort, the grandfather to the future king and future lord of the tides. It's this ambition for legacy that drives him, at least until both his children die. And that's going to be the same in this timeline, and Otto recognizes that ambition in Coryls. The situation kind of mirrors the conversation the Sea Snake had with the Rogue Prince in episode 2. Otto talks about the realm and how things changed the moment Laena sired a son. Of course, Coryls doesn't care about gender that much, but he's not a fool. Laena's son Aegon is the king's firstborn son, and the oldest out of her twins since he came out first. The people expect him to be heir to the throne, and it doesn't help that he has a really strong claim to it. Not only is he the blood of King Viserys, he's also the blood of Princess Rhaenys. She has a claim to the throne through her father Aemon Targaryen, who was the eldest son of old King Jaehaerys. He was the old king's heir before he was killed, and the old king named Viserys' father Balon as heir to the throne instead. Laena's children have the blood of both Aemon and Balon through Viserys and Rhaenys, so they have a very strong claim to the Iron Throne. Aegon specifically, since he's a boy, and Westeros is all about that. The cards are very much stacked in his favor. If he was named heir, the realm would fate him for it. All Coryls would have to do is convince the king. But would Coryls actually do that? Well, it's perfectly plausible. By Otto appealing to his ego, his pride and ambition, I could easily see Coryls trying to sway Viserys. He's all about legacy, and what reads better in the history books? Grandfather to the prince, or grandfather to the king? Rhaenys may have some issues with this though, since she doesn't really care about the throne like he does. But even though Coryls loves her and respects her opinion, he's gone around her before. Like when he put Laena up for a betrothal, something Rhaenys was not okay with. and when he refused to change Driftmark's succession when Rhaenys wanted Baela to inherit instead of Luke. He said it was to help the boys, but it's clear he's just preserving his makeshift legacy. And with Otto's meddling, this gives Corlys some incentive to try and find the White Hart during the hunt. The White Hart is seen as a symbol of legitimacy for those who don't know. While this occurs, Daemon actually returns for the first time in years on Caraxes. It's a spectacle, to be sure, with Daemon reciting that he believes his invitation must have been misplaced. Of course, we will ask why Daemon returned, and then he makes his big reveal. Daemon did not come alone. He brought his son. In the 3 years he was away on Runestone, he actually fathered the child on Lady Rhea. Now, that's not to say the two of them fell in love or anything in this timeline, because plenty of people don't love each other and they still manage to have children, which ended up being the case for Daemon and his wife. For reasons unknown to everyone else, he and Rhea finally consummated their marriage. Daemon remarks that it wasn't entirely unpleasant, and that even the harshest soil can still bear fruit, taking another jab at his wife. And the product of this union was their son, Maegor, the future Lord of Runestone, who was still a baby at this time and almost a year old. Now, I'm gonna cut the video here. I got a bit carried away, and this video is getting a bit longer than I thought. Honestly, aside from my own creative liberties, there's a lot to tackle with this what if. With Laena becoming Viserys' queen, a lot changes. We get an entirely new cast of characters through her children with Viserys. Their personalities are going to be big question marks since they never existed at all in canon. They aren't the Green Children. They could grow up to be anyone. There are new possibilities for alliances and conflicts. Speaking of which, there's Rhaenyra and Alicent. Both of them are single. Alicent didn't have to marry Viserys in this timeline. Rhaenyra also doesn't have to marry Laenor anymore. They could marry anyone. There's a lot of options for them, but I digress. So much could honestly happen, and I don't know if I can go over that without this turning into a bit of fanfic. This is also why I ended up making my Balon video pretty straightforward, because as a character, Balon is just one big question mark. No one knows who he could have been had he grown up since he died so young. He could have been a second Aegon the Conqueror, or a second Maegor for all we know. But I decided to keep things simple and optimistic for that what if. Here, though, it's a bit more complicated and it can go in many more directions, which I kinda show with giving Daemon a son at the end. So if you guys want me to come back to this in a part 2 in the future, let me know in the comments. For now, though, I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.